I turned 54 last spring. It was an age I never imagined reaching with this much silence around me. The mornings felt the same: coffee, a quiet house, a chair near the window where the sunlight used to feel warm but now only reminded me how still everything had become. My husband and I had separated 2 years ago, though in truth, we'd been living apart long before that. He had drifted into a world of work and excuses, and I had simply faded into the background of our shared life until one day, there was nothing left to hold on to. My son, Daniel, had been the only constant light through it all. He was grown now, busy with his own life, and I was proud of him. When he told me he and his friend Jake would be stopping by to help me with some house repairs, I smiled politely. I hadn't seen Jake in years. He used to come by as a teenager, loud, full of jokes, always raiding the fridge. I still remembered him as the boy who tripped over his own shoes trying to impress everyone. When they arrived, I barely recognized him. Jake was no longer that awkward kid. He was tall, broad-shouldered, confident. He had the kind of easy smile that makes you want to smile back even when you don't feel like it. I told myself it was maternal affection when I complimented how much he'd grown, but the truth was, his presence unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. He fixed the kitchen shelf that had been loose for months, chatting with Daniel about sports and work. I stayed near the counter, pretending to tidy up while secretly watching them. There was something warm about hearing laughter in the house again. For a moment, it felt like the emptiness had lifted, replaced by the echo of something familiar: connection. That night, after they left, I sat on the sofa staring at the shelf Jake had repaired. My fingers traced the edge of the wood, still slightly rough but sturdy again. It felt symbolic somehow, as if something fragile in me had been quietly put back together too. I shook the thought off, embarrassed at myself. I was a middle-aged woman romanticizing kindness. Still, when I went to bed, I couldn't help but think of how he had smiled when I thanked him. Gentle, sincere, the kind of smile I hadn't received in years. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Jake came by a few more times. They worked in the backyard, repaired the gutters, helped with small chores. I would make them lemonade or sandwiches, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. Jake had a way of making me laugh easily, something I had almost forgotten how to do. He was attentive. He noticed when I changed my hairstyle, when I wore a different perfume. It wasn't flirtatious, not at first. Just noticing. But when you've spent years being invisible, even being noticed feels like a dangerous kind of light. One afternoon, Daniel left early for work, leaving Jake to finish painting the garden fence. I brought him a glass of water, the air heavy with the smell of fresh paint and summer heat. He thanked me, his eyes holding mine a moment too long. There was nothing in that look I could name, but it stayed with me. Later, as I washed the glass, my reflection in the kitchen window seemed unfamiliar, almost softer. It startled me. I began to look forward to his visits more than I should have. I told myself it was just nice to have company, that anyone would feel the same after so much solitude. But I started paying attention to what I wore, choosing softer colors, taking a little more time with my hair. I wasn't trying to impress him, at least, that's what I told myself. Maybe I just wanted to feel like a woman again, not a ghost walking through her own home. One morning, Daniel called to say he couldn't make it that weekend, but Jake would still stop by to finish fixing a loose drawer in the living room. My stomach fluttered, though I tried to tell myself it was only gratitude. When he arrived, the house felt too quiet. He worked in silence while I folded laundry nearby, pretending to be busy. The sunlight caught his arms as he moved, and for a brief second, I noticed how steady his hands were, how easy his confidence seemed. It made me nervous, and I hated that it did. We talked idly about life. He told me about his recent breakup, how he was tired of people who only wanted excitement. I admitted how lonely the house felt since Daniel moved out. It was a simple exchange, but something changed in the air between us. The pauses grew longer, the smiles softer. When I stood to bring the folded laundry upstairs, I brushed past him, and the space between us felt charged. I could feel his gaze on me as I left the room, and for the first time in years, I didn't want to hide from it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about the look in his eyes, the warmth in his voice. I hated myself for it. He was my son's best friend. I was old enough to know better. But feelings don't ask permission. They just appear, uninvited, and suddenly you're standing at the edge of something you never intended to find. The following weekend, when Daniel came by with Jake again, I tried to act normal. But every word felt rehearsed, every smile a little forced. Jake, however, was his usual calm self. If he sensed my awkwardness, he hid it well. Still, there were moments when our eyes met, and it felt like we were both remembering that quiet afternoon alone. After they left, I found myself in front of the mirror again, studying the fine lines on my face, the faint sag of my jaw, the way age had settled softly across my skin. I didn't hate what I saw, but I couldn't stop wondering what he had seen. Had he looked at me with pity, curiosity, or something more dangerous? In the days that followed, I tried to distance myself emotionally. I filled my schedule, went on long walks, visited old friends. But nothing worked. Every small reminder, paint on the fence, a repaired shelf, a glass left on the counter, pulled me back into the memory of his quiet smile and the feeling of being seen. I told myself I was foolish, that this was nothing but midlife loneliness wearing a younger man's face. And yet, deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe it wasn't foolish at all. Maybe it was human. Maybe it was what happens when a heart that has been silent too long suddenly hears its own pulse again. The day I saw him next, I knew something inside me had shifted. It was subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. He looked at me the same way as before, steady, curious, a hint of warmth behind his eyes, and I realized how easily a single look could undo years of practiced restraint. I didn't know what it meant or where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. My quiet life was no longer quiet. Something had changed, and pretending otherwise wouldn't make it untrue. I didn't want to admit it then, but that was the moment everything began to unravel. Softly, silently, like a thread you don't notice pulling until it's too late to stop. The next time Jake came by, Daniel wasn't with him. He had mentioned he was working overtime, so Jake offered to stop in and finish fixing a loose door hinge. It should have been nothing, a simple favor. Yet as soon as I opened the door and saw him standing there, something inside me tightened. There was a quiet between us that hadn't been there before, a stillness that felt like anticipation. He stepped inside, smiling in that easy way of his, and I felt that same confusing rush again, warmth mixed with guilt. He asked about my week, I asked about his, and our voices filled the house in that soft, familiar rhythm that had started to feel too natural. We weren't doing anything wrong, but the awareness of what could be was thick in the air. While he worked, I tried to stay busy in the kitchen. I could hear the faint sound of tools clicking, wood creaking, his quiet humming. It was ordinary, and yet I couldn't focus on anything else. My hands trembled slightly as I rinsed dishes, and when I dropped a plate, the crash startled us both. He rushed in immediately, crouched beside me, and helped pick up the broken pieces. Our fingers brushed, and that single touch felt like a spark in a dark room. I looked up at him, and for a long second, neither of us moved. He smiled faintly, his voice lower than usual. "You okay?" I nodded, but I wasn't. I was aware of every heartbeat, every inch of air between us. I pulled my hand back quickly, trying to collect myself. He stood, handed me the last shard of glass, and said softly, "You shouldn't try to do everything yourself." It was a harmless comment, but it hit deeper than it should have. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone said something that sounded like care. Later, when he finished fixing the hinge, I offered him coffee. He hesitated, then accepted. We sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the surface, turning the steam from our cups into soft, swirling ribbons. He asked if I ever got lonely. I froze, not sure how to answer. I told him I was used to it. He didn't respond right away, just looked at me with that calm, steady gaze that made me feel both seen and exposed. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "You shouldn't have to be." It was such a simple sentence, but it landed like a confession. My throat tightened. I tried to laugh it off, to change the subject, but my voice betrayed me. The air felt charged again, heavy with words neither of us wanted to say out loud. When he stood to leave, he thanked me for the coffee and smiled. But then, as he picked up his toolbox, I dropped a folded towel that had been resting on the counter. I bent to grab it at the same moment he did. Our hands brushed again, Closer this time, and I felt his breath catch. When I straightened up, he looked directly at me, his eyes darker than before. The silence was unbearable. That's when he said it. The words came out low, teasing, but with an edge that made my pulse race. You don't have to do everything yourself, you know, sometimes you should let someone else help. Bend over, I'll get it. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The tone was careful, almost testing, like he was waiting to see if I'd pull away. I froze. For a split second, a dozen thoughts collided in my mind. Shock, embarrassment, anger, curiosity. But when I finally looked at him, I saw something in his eyes that stopped me. It wasn't mockery or disrespect. It was want. Hesitant, restrained, but unmistakable. My heart pounded. I told myself to say something, to break the tension, to remind him and myself of the boundaries between us. But I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just stood there, breath shallow, my mind a blur of right and wrong. He stepped back quickly, as if realizing he'd gone too far. Sorry, he murmured, voice tight. That came out wrong. I shook my head, forcing a smile I didn't feel. It's fine, I said, but my voice was barely a whisper. After he left, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. My emotions tangled into knots, confusion, shame, a strange kind of longing that I couldn't justify. I replayed his tone, his look, the moment we both froze. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was a misunderstanding, but the lie didn't stick. Something had shifted between us, whether I wanted it to or not. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely did. I sat by the window, the city quiet outside, and let my thoughts wander where they shouldn't. No one had spoken to me that way in years. Not with desire, not with curiosity, not with life. The memory of his voice replayed again and again, and each time, I felt that same mix of fear and electricity. The next day, I avoided checking my phone. I didn't expect a message, but part of me hoped for one. When Daniel texted to say Jake might stop by again to pick up a forgotten tool, I felt my chest tighten. I told myself I would act normal, keep things distant, keep things safe. But when I opened the door that evening and saw him standing there again, I knew normal was already gone. We exchanged polite words, pretending nothing had happened. But there was something new in the silence between sentences. His eyes lingered just a little longer. My answers came out just a little softer. Every movement felt deliberate, cautious, careful not to cross an invisible line that already felt blurred. When he left, he paused at the door and said quietly, I didn't mean to make things awkward. I told him it wasn't awkward, though we both knew it was. He nodded, but before turning away, he added, you deserve to be treated like you matter. Then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, the echo of his words filling the room. I didn't know what to call what was happening. Temptation, madness, loneliness. But I knew one thing. Something inside me had been set in motion, and it wouldn't stop just because I told it to. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. That he was just being kind, that I was imagining things because I'd been alone too long. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't misread it. That moment, those words, bend over, had changed something fundamental. Not just between us, but inside me. I felt alive again, in a way I hadn't for years. It terrified me. And yet, despite everything I told myself, I knew I didn't want to go back to the way things were before. 4 days after that moment, I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. I told myself that the silence after his words was only my imagination, that I had overreacted, that a 54-year-old woman should not be losing sleep over something as foolish as a look or a sentence. But denial has a short life. The truth was that I couldn't stop thinking about him. It began innocently enough. Every morning when I made coffee, I thought of him standing in my kitchen, smiling. When I walked past the repaired shelf, I caught myself remembering the way he watched me when I bent to pick up the towel. The house felt smaller, the air thicker, as though every corner held the echo of his voice. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Jake. His tone was hesitant. He said he had left a screwdriver behind and asked if he could come by to get it. I said yes before I could think. When I hung up, I stared at the phone, wishing I had said no and knowing I wouldn't have meant it. He arrived just before dusk. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I handed him the screwdriver, expecting him to leave, but he stayed, shifting from foot to foot. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry for what I said the other day. It was stupid." I told him it was forgotten, that it was nothing. But he didn't look convinced. His eyes stayed on mine, steady, searching. "It wasn't nothing," he said quietly. "It felt like something." There it was. The truth neither of us had wanted to name. I should have stopped him, should have reminded him that he was my son's friend, that this was wrong in every possible way. But the words refused to come. Instead, I felt the room tilt, as if the air itself had shifted. He took a step closer. I could smell the faint scent of paint and soap on his skin. "You make me feel calm," he said. "You listen. You look at me like I matter." His honesty was disarming. I wanted to tell him that he was too young, that I was too old, that this was just loneliness pretending to be affection. But my heart had other ideas. "Jake," I whispered, but it came out more like a plea than a warning. He reached for my hand, slowly, as though giving me time to pull away. I didn't. The warmth of his fingers sent a jolt through me. For years, no one had touched me with tenderness. I had forgotten how skin could remember. We didn't kiss that night. He left before anything else could happen, but the silence he left behind was louder than any confession. I sat in the dark for hours afterward, feeling equal parts guilt and gratitude. The next few days were torture. Every message notification made my stomach flutter. Every quiet evening reminded me how quickly temptation can grow roots. When his text finally came, "Can I see you?" I didn't answer right away. I stared at it for hours, fighting a battle I was already losing. The following evening, I opened the door for him again. He looked uncertain, as though waiting for me to decide what we were. I stepped aside, letting him in, and that single gesture was the answer he needed. We talked for a long time that night. About everything: life, disappointment, choices. He told me about his parents' divorce, how he had always felt invisible. I told him about the years I had spent pretending to be fine. There was something freeing about speaking without judgment, without fear of interruption. When the conversation faded into silence, he moved closer. His hand brushed my cheek, and I didn't stop him. The first kiss was tentative, almost careful, like a question neither of us knew how to answer. When it deepened, I felt years of loneliness melt away into something I couldn't name. It wasn't about passion, not really. It was about being seen, about feeling the pulse of life after years of quiet decay. When he held me, I wasn't 54 and forgotten. I was simply a woman, breathing, present, real. Afterward, guilt set in like a shadow creeping across the floor. I sat at the edge of the bed, wrapped in silence, wondering what I had done. He tried to reassure me, said it didn't have to mean anything bad, that we could keep it between us. But secrets have weight, and I could already feel this one pressing on my chest. The next morning, he left early. The house felt emptier than ever. I told myself it had been a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again. But when his message came that evening, "I can't stop thinking about you." I read it once, deleted it, then retyped my reply 3 times before finally turning off the phone. For a few days, I avoided him completely. Daniel called, cheerful and oblivious, and I forced myself to sound normal. But pretending normal became harder each day. Every sound outside made me think Jake might be there again. Every quiet hour made me question what I really wanted. Eventually, I saw him again by accident. Daniel had invited him over for dinner, unaware of the invisible fire between us. When I opened the door and saw them both standing there, my heart stopped. I forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. But sitting across from him at the table, I could feel the tension under my skin. Every laugh, every glance, every movement was measured, careful. When Daniel stepped outside to take a call, the silence between us returned. Jake whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded, but I knew he could see through it. His gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer than it should have, and in that moment, I realized how fragile everything had become. That night, after they left, I cried quietly. I wasn't sure if it was from shame or longing. I wanted to undo it all, to go back to being invisible, to the safety of emptiness. But part of me couldn't. For the first time in years, I felt something that wasn't numbness, and even if it was wrong, it was real. A few days later, Daniel mentioned that Jake would be stopping by again to return a borrowed ladder. My stomach knotted. I knew I should find a reason to be away, to make it easy for both of us. But I didn't. When Jake arrived, the look in his eyes said everything we hadn't dared to speak. The moment stretched between us like a fragile thread, shimmering with danger and desire. We both knew it couldn't last, that it shouldn't have begun. And yet, when he stepped forward and I didn't move away, the thread finally snapped. The rest of that night was a blur of emotion. Tenderness, fear, relief. It wasn't wild or reckless. It was quiet, full of unspoken apologies and the ache of knowing how wrong it was. When he held me, I felt both alive and doomed. After he left, I sat alone in the half-light of dawn, the air thick with the scent of rain. I whispered to myself that it was over, that I would end it before anyone got hurt. But deep down, I already knew I wouldn't. Because for all the guilt, all the shame, all the impossibility, he had reminded me what it felt like to be wanted. And once you remember that feeling, forgetting it is almost impossible. It didn't take long for everything to unravel. Secrets are never quiet for long, and ours was no exception. The guilt I carried began to show in small ways, hesitations, half-answers, the way my voice trembled when Daniel mentioned Jake's name. I told myself I was being careful, but my heart had already betrayed me. Every stolen moment, every hidden glance had left a trace that couldn't be erased. Jake started to pull away first. It wasn't dramatic, just small changes. He stopped texting as often. He avoided my eyes when Daniel was around. When he did come by, there was a nervousness in his movements, as if every step in my direction might set off an alarm. I didn't blame him. The weight of what we were doing had grown too heavy to carry. But knowing that didn't make it hurt less. One afternoon, Daniel came home unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after Jake had left only minutes before. My son walked in holding a wrench that Jake had apparently forgotten, and something in his expression made my stomach turn. He looked at me for a long moment, frowning slightly. "You've been seeing a lot of Jake lately," he said casually. It wasn't an accusation, but I heard the suspicion underneath. I forced a laugh. "He's just been helping around the house," I said. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. He nodded slowly, still watching me. "Yeah, I know. He mentioned it." Then he added, almost to himself, "He's been weird lately though, quiet. Not like him." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the look in Daniel's eyes, the almost question he hadn't asked. The walls of the house felt closer than ever, and I realized the line between secrecy and discovery had almost disappeared. I told myself I would end it, that I would tell Jake not to come anymore. But the next day, when I saw his message, "Can we talk?" I couldn't ignore it. We met at a small cafe outside town, somewhere no one would know us. The silence between us was heavy. He looked tired, conflicted. "We can't keep doing this," he said finally. "It's not fair, to Daniel, to you, to anyone." I nodded, staring at the table. "I know." But knowing didn't make it easier. There were no accusations between us, no anger. Just quiet sadness and the kind of understanding that comes when two people realize they were never meant to last. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said. "I know," I whispered. "Neither did I." When he left, I sat there long after my coffee had gone cold. Watching him walk away felt like watching a piece of myself dissolve. I had told myself from the beginning that this was temporary, that it couldn't last, but I hadn't expected it to end with such emptiness. Days turned into weeks. Jake stopped coming by altogether. Daniel stopped mentioning him. I thought maybe it was over, buried under time and silence. But the truth has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. It happened one evening when Daniel came over for dinner. We were talking about nothing important when he suddenly went quiet. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, then said, "Mom, did something happen between you and Jake?" The world seemed to stop. My fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes were searching mine, not with anger but disbelief, hurt, confusion. "Daniel," I started, but my voice broke. There was no point denying it. He already knew. He pushed back his chair, shaking his head. I don't even know what to say. He was like my brother. The pain in his voice was unbearable. "It wasn't planned," I said weakly. "It just happened. I didn't mean to." He cut in, his tone sharp now. "You think that makes it better?" There was nothing I could say that would make it better. The silence between us stretched into something raw and final. When he left that night, he didn't look back. The sound of the door closing behind him was the loudest thing I had ever heard. After that, everything felt different. The house that once felt too quiet now felt unbearable. I tried calling him, texting him, but he didn't respond. I even thought about reaching out to Jake, but what would I say? That I had ruined everything? That the small spark that had made me feel alive had also burned down the only steady thing I had left? Weeks passed. Then one morning, I saw Jake's name on my phone again. The message was short: "I'm leaving town for a while. Take care of yourself." That was it. No explanation, no goodbye. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I deleted them, not because I wanted to forget, but because I knew I never would. In the quiet that followed, I began to see things more clearly. What happened between us hadn't been about lust or rebellion. It had been about loneliness, the kind that sinks deep into your bones and makes you forget who you are. Jake had been a mirror, reflecting back the parts of me I thought were gone. The woman, not the mother, not the wife, but the person who still wanted to feel something. I thought for a long time about what it meant, about right and wrong, about the choices people make when they're desperate to feel alive. There's no excuse for betrayal, but there's also no denying that we are all human, flawed and fragile. Daniel eventually spoke to me again, months later. His voice was distant, cautious. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't want them. He just said, "I forgive you, Mom. But I can't forget it." That was enough. Forgiveness, even partial, is a gift I didn't deserve. Now, sometimes when I sit by the window with my morning coffee, I catch a glimpse of sunlight across the yard and think of those days. The laughter, the tension, the warmth of being seen. I don't romanticize it anymore. It was wrong, and it hurt people I love. But it also woke something inside me that had been asleep for too long. I learned that desire doesn't disappear with age, that loneliness can make you do things you swore you never would, and that feeling alive comes at a price. I still think of him sometimes, his quiet smile, his gentle voice, the way he looked at me as if I mattered. And then I remind myself that I do matter, even without him. Maybe that's the one good thing that came from all this. At 54, I broke rules I thought were unbreakable. I lost trust, I lost people, but I also found something, an understanding of myself I had buried under years of being everything for everyone else. If I could go back, I'd make different choices. But I can't. Life doesn't let you rewrite the chapters you regret. It only lets you live with them, learn from them, and keep turning the pages. And so I do. Quietly, carefully, with the knowledge that even mistakes can remind us that we're still human. That we still have hearts capable of breaking and healing.